Sister Nwando, thank you very much. It's always a delight to see you, and thank you for finding the time to do this. Congratulations on your new publication and newly minted position as the incoming Vice President of African Studies Association here in North America. So I wanted to start by asking you if your daughter, Chino, or my daughter, Jerry, were to ask you what this book is about, what would be your response?
Wachanga, thank you so very much for having me. I'm just exceedingly excited to be here. What is this story about? I would say to them that it's about them, right? It's about you. It's about our mothers. It's about our grandmothers. And it's about, every and all African women that you can think of. That's what propels me to do this. It's that desire to see myself in history. That's why I started this journey. If I were to look back to my grad student years at UCLA and being exposed to histories that were supposedly on me, that I couldn't recognize myself in those histories. Stories that had titles like Beast of Burden and the subordination of Swanan women. And I'm sitting in class and I'm wondering, who are these beasts of burden? How dare these authors write about African women as beasts of burden? Or these women they claimed were sold to the highest bidder for their productive or reproductive labors. Those weren't women that I recognized. Those were not my mother, not my aunts, not my grandmother, not any African women that I recognized. And so for me, the writing of African women's worlds or rewriting of African women's worlds was very much my attempt to be able to see myself in history. And so when you say, what would I say to them? I would say this book is about you. As young African girls, women, this is about you. I want you to see yourself in this history. But this is also a book for African Caribbean girls and women, African American. Peter Tosh says, wherever there's a Black person, he or she's an African. And this book, definitely more so than any other of my books, was really to speak to this group of especially young African, and when I say African, I'm talking about the African diaspora, African girls and young women, to say that we too have a history that we can be exceedingly proud of. Right. And what I tried to do was document the histories of some of the most powerful African women and what I call the female principle. So that which you cannot see that is female. And for us to sort of look at that and realize that we came from something. So let nobody tell you that you did not come from something. We came from something that is exceedingly powerful, that is exceedingly important. And these women, whether we're talking about Hatshepsut in Egypt, so I talk about her from Egypt, that they have a story to tell, and that story is our story, right? It's our story. They're the ones who paved the way to allow somebody like me, to allow my daughter, to allow your daughter to speak with confidence and have the confidence in ourselves as African women. And so it's these stories that I wanted to tell. And to me, they're exceedingly empowering. They make me happy to be an African woman. When I learn about, these exceedingly powerful women, it gives me the confidence and joy in being who I am and not wanting to be anybody else but an African woman.
Wow, that's powerful. Take me through the biography of the book. how did you conceive the idea of this book? How did you conduct the research? And how was the writing process?
So this one is my sixth book. It's my smallest book, but it was the most difficult to write, most difficult. And part of the difficulty had to do with the fact that this is probably 160 pages, 180 pages, certainly under, I think, 200 pages. But I had made a conscious decision to document all of African women's and what I call the female principles histories. You know, those of us who have studied in the US know that a lot of times North Africa is taken out of Africa and placed in the Middle East as Middle Eastern history. And I was fighting against that in this book. I wanted to tell the history of all African women and the female principle. So one of the most difficult things for me in the beginning was, how do I tell these histories in such a short book? There were so many histories to tell. How do I choose one, what to include and what not to include? So that was exceedingly difficult for me. The other thing that was difficult is that with a lot of these histories that I documented in this book, you know, these histories are scattered in so many different places. And so being able to sort of bring them all together into a coherent whole and tell the story, a lot of times was a challenge, because in some instances, the evidence that I had for certain stories was few and far between. You know, as a historian, you deal with evidence, and there's evidence and there is, not all evidence is equal. And so being able to deal with the evidence that was there in order to produce this story that I was trying to tell was another challenge. But, you know, I was just exceedingly excited to have the opportunity to write on Ohio's short history. And as far as I know, before my book, each of these short histories was either on an individual. And what I wanted to do was write the history of African women and the female principle, you know, because I made two things clear, is that I wanted to write a history of African women in their entirety, but I also wanted to write a history of the unseen world that's female, the spiritual world. Because in all of my work, one of my major arguments is that you only tell part of African history by focusing in on the human physical world. We're leaving out half of African history by doing that. And that's because as Africans, the way that we conceptualize our world, we have these two worlds that are in operation, the physical and the spiritual.
I want to go back to how the book is described, that you break away from Western perspectives, research methods, and their consequently incomplete, skewed accounts to demonstrate the critical importance of distinctly African source material in the worldview and worldviews to any comprehensible African history.
Yeah.
How did you do that? You know, and I mean, how are you able to break away from these, Western perspectives? And why was it important for you to find an African-centered approach?
Yeah, thank you for that. I like to say that I don't know that I would know how to write African history from a perspective that is not African. I wouldn't even know what to do, how to even go about that. You know, I talked to you earlier about my experience in grad school. That very much shaped the kind of research that I do today. You know, it's about that desire to see myself in history. And I found that the regular sources, like archival sources, did not speak to me. So when I talked about the article on the Beast of Burden, you know, the author was able to talk about African women in that way by looking at the archive, as though the archive is this unbiased place, right? And so for me, it's about challenging knowledge to recognize myself in history. And what that has led me to do, And it's not me. It's not about me trying to come up with a sexy methodology. No, it's what I needed to do to uncover the history of Africans from an African perspective. And so when I talk about looking at African history through proverbs that explain society to itself, looking at African history through names, what are the names telling us? Language, linguistics, right? Looking at African history through African worldview. What are the traditions of creation telling us? These are the distinctively African ways in which Africans interpret their own histories, songs, dances. So there's her story in the weaving tradition, or there's her story in the pottery tradition. And so that's what I've done, is I have looked for all avenues for reconstructing this thing that we call women's history or gender history. And I have necessarily had to do it in order to tell this history. Because if you look at the traditional archives, women's voices are few and far between. Those archivists, people think, oh, it's just, the archive is wonderful. Yeah, I'm not saying don't use the archive. I'm saying that we need to know what the history of the archive is. That these government-appointed anthropologists came hand in hand with the colonial enterprise. So it was really the colonizing enterprise that brought those people to Africa, and they wrote those accounts that survive today that we use today. And I like to say that people who are trying to colonize, to steal away land that is not theirs, are not going to write glowing stories about the colonized. And so if we're going to use that, and I use the archive, the traditional archive, but we have to be very careful in the way that we use it. What are the silences? What is not said? How about the traditional archive of the African elder? Those are the kinds of archives that I've used, not only in this book, but all of my writing.
What you have described in the book as, and I quote, the two realities of African cosmology, end of quote. In my view, they serve as a critical intervention in our understanding of African history.
Yes, yes.
Tell me more about these two realities. And as I mentioned before, these two realities of African cosmology reminds me of your father's statement that among the Igbo we say, where one thing stands, another thing can stand as well.
Yes.
Tell me about these two realities, and also tell me, how do these realities allow our existence to produce what you have described as male priestesses, female kings, female pharaohs?
Yes. Yeah. Where one thing stands, something else will stand beside it. And, in the Igbo language, we say, where one thing stands, something else will stand beside it. And that's the philosophy of the Igbo people. But it's also, I would argue, the philosophy of most African peoples. If somebody were to write my obituary today and talk about what was Nwando's contribution to knowledge, I would hope that one of the most important things that they would identify, of course, to say that I write about women, gender, and sexuality in Africa, but I think that the most important thing that I have contributed to knowledge is the elevating of the spiritual world. Where one thing stands, something stands beside it. You cannot tell the history of Africa without considering Africa in its entirety. And the African world, or world, is made up of these two worlds. The human world in which we live in. You are a human being, I can see you, can see me. We're humans. But Africans also believe that there's spirits all around us, right? And in fact, I have argued, much like C.K. Meek before me has argued, that the real rulers of African towns were the gods and goddesses, and that people, human beings, were only there to interpret the will of the deities. So this spiritual world is a higher world, right? And when we think about African worlds, I also think about African worldview, the fact that most African peoples believe in reincarnation, that you grow, that you're born, you grow old, you die, and you're reborn and the cycle continues. It's that whole idea of the never-ending cycle of life. And that's what I've tried to capture in all of my work, right? That as I try to historicize the histories or her stories of women, that I can't only exclusively focus on human beings. How about her stories of forces that are female, like goddesses? How about her stories of women that really occupy what I call the in-between worlds? And these women are women like priestesses, prophetesses, spirit mediums. These are all the women that I cover in this book. There are women that are born human, but have been endowed with spiritual idiosyncrasies. They are more than human. They are the ones that interpret the non-human world, the world that we cannot see, to us. And so what I have tried to do in my work is not only historicize the human realm in talking about, women's roles in politics, in economics, in religion, but also the spiritual, that which you cannot see. So when you talk about politics, you have two political constituencies. You have the human, where you have women leaders, whether they're queen mothers, whether they're Nwada's daughters. These are female leaders. But you also have the spiritual political constituency, where you have goddesses who are the leaders. Or you have the big God, this big God that is neither male or female. We're talking about the dualities here, right? So when we talk about God, in most African cultures, God is neither male or female. And so we talk about this genderless God. Why has God been written about as male in the English language or in a lot of these European languages, whether it's English, Portuguese, German, French? It's because these languages are gender specific, but African languages are not. And so they have necessarily made God he.
As you mentioned, these are complex ideas, especially when you're explaining them to others. But you've been able to do that in a language that is impressively accessible. We talked about access, but the language that you use allow us to understand what these ideas are, despite their complexity.
Yes.
And take me through how did you achieve this? First of all, how do you talk about complex ideas in an accessible language?
Yes.
And why was this important for you?
So very important. And Wachanga, I know that you will appreciate this. We're both scholars. We know how our people write, academics write. And I just remember, whether it's sitting in class or picking up a book and just getting frustrated, just very frustrated. We both have PhDs. We're very intelligent people. And, my whole thing is if I pick up a book and I have to constantly go to a dictionary, who the heck are you writing for? Especially those of us that write about Africa, those of us that write about these stories that have been entrusted to us by a lot of times by people who cannot read. I'll tell you a quick story. And I'm happy that it happened very early in my research. It's the Lady Obai story. So I'm listening to Lady Obai, and here she is talking to me and telling me that everything that she knew about what it means to be a woman Everything that she knew about what it means to be powerful, she learned from the Christian church. And I'm listening and I'm saying, like, I'm not talking, but in my mind, I'm like, oh, there's no way. I'm not using her story. This does not fit neatly into my analysis. I'm just debating with myself. I'm like, what does she mean? Everything she learned about what it means to be a woman, she learned from the Christian church, and I'm thinking all of this. All of a sudden, and this was in 1996, Lady Obai tells me to turn off my tape recorder. And now I'm aging myself because we used tape recorders at that time. And I did. And she reached out to me, held me in both hands, and she said, my daughter, you know I don't understand book. I cannot read. I need to know that what I am saying, that you are going to represent me in that book that I cannot read the way that I represent myself. So, my daughter, tell me what it is that I've said to you. So Lady Obai challenged me to tell her what she had said to me. And it wasn't as though I wasn't listening. I knew what she was saying, but I knew that I was not going to, young like it doesn't fit in my thesis. And I heard myself parroting back what it is that she had said to me that I didn't believe. There she was looking at me, and she reached out and she said to me, my daughter, you have proven to me that you will represent me in that book that I cannot read the way that I represent myself. She said, my daughter, turn that tape back on. The interview can truly begin now. I tell this story because Lady Obai forced me to acknowledge that I had an agenda. And that if you're going to do this kind of history that I do, you must listen, truly listen, but also truly hear the stories that these women are. So she's the one who forced me to write what I call a balanced history. But you asked me about accessibility. It's so vitally important because the question is, as academics, who is our audience? And for me, I'm very clear on who my audience is. My audience are the men and women, yes, men and women, who entrusted me with their stories. I need to be able to write in a manner that they can not only read, receive, and if necessary, critique.
What would you consider to be the major contribution of this work?
It's really to challenge canon to say that African women are not beasts of burden. African women are not women who are sold to the highest bidder for their productive or reproductive labor. That African women are just like any other women, right? They have excelled in many avenues, in many areas. They go through struggles as well, right? And so to really be able to present African women in their authenticity is what my work, my body of work has been. But it goes back to that very first question that you asked me about our daughters. In each of my books, I always say, there's always that line where I say to my daughter, I hope that by reading her stories, that you find pride in who you are as an African woman. And so it's really a simple thing, unearthing the histories and the her stories of African women to a generation of people who have been told that they come from nothingness. And to challenge that to say, these are imperfect women, but they're women that we can be proud of in their imperfections. And so I look at a book like this one and I say that I've presented the history or the her stories of all of us. My hope is that anyone who picks up this book, especially if they're of African descent, can see themselves in the history. And so when people tell me, as I was reading the history of my aunt. I was reading, you reminded me of my mother that died many years ago, but so-and-so reminded me of her. And all I can say is thank you for sharing that, because that's the reason I do what I do.
When you are done with all the research, the book came out. After all that journey, Nwando, what surprised you the most?
Well, what surprised me the most? When you think about my journey with writing African history, I mean, I'm coming up on almost 30 years of doing this work. And so I can't say that I'm no longer shocked or surprised. I'm always pleasantly excited. Let me put it that way. As I was doing research for this book, I learned about the Lovadu Rain Queens, which really sort of talk back and turn canon on its head when it comes to this dual sex system. The Lovadu do not have a dual sex system. They don't have male kings. They had male kings, rain kings, at some point in history, but the men did not rule well. And so the society got rid of them, and they now have the female rain queens who rule alone. So there's not that dual sex system amongst the Lovadu. So it's stories, it's histories like that that really excite me, because they challenge received canon about what we know about African women.
What are the challenges that you faced, and how did you overcome them?
So with this particular book, it was I would say personal, very, very personal challenge, which I talk a little bit about in my acknowledgments in the book. This was, I started off by saying this is one of the most difficult books that I've ever written. It's the smallest book I've ever written, but I was working on it at a time when my life fell apart. My father had just passed away. I was dealing with the trauma of that. Very, very difficult. I was very close with my father. And then as I continued to try to put, string these sentences together to make history, my spouse became blind. And so dealing with two very traumatic events made it so that it was very, very difficult for me to find my voice in this writing. And so I missed deadline after deadline. I think this book was maybe 5 years late. And, I am very appreciative that Ohio University Press, really from time to time would just call me just to see where things, they wanted the book, right? And so that sort of encouraged me to keep going. But because of these traumas, the writing process for me was very, very difficult. And I believe that it was as I started to heal that I started to regain voice.
Yeah, I just want to say this for the record, that your husband, Folo Ogodemo, is also a good friend of mine.
Yes.
And, we don't have many African professors in the American Academy who are in journalism. And when I started teaching, Folo was my mentor, because we have been in panels together, and he was very kind and very generous to hold my hand when I joined the academy. So besides, knowing you as a friend, follow, has been a mentor to me. And I'm so glad that I know your family. And I am also aware of how close you are to your father. And this explains your name, Nwando, which I have had a chance of listening to you talking about where the name came from. And if you don't mind, do you want to share with us? Nwando.
Sure,
Yeah.
of course. My full name is Nwando. The child is a shade. My middle name is Onalo. The house is settled. And my last name, people don't know this. Achebe is a short form of Achebe. The goddess of the lands protects us. Right? So Nwando is given to the youngest child because it is believed that as the youngest child, I stay and spend the most time with my parents. In fact, I was the only one who didn't go to boarding school in my family. All my siblings went to boarding school. I didn't last in boarding school. I was just there for a semester, and I had to run back home. So I stay longest with my parents, and the idea is that you shield and protect them as a tree. The child is a shade in their old age. And so when I think about my name, I believe that I've answered my name with respect to the close relationship that I had with my parents, and I continue with my father, and I continue to have with my mother. My father died in our arms, right? We were there singing and praying. It was a beautiful death. I don't know how else to put it. Death is painful, but my dad's death was beautiful. So that close relationship with my parents. Onalo, I like to describe, it's a name that my parents made up. There's no other Onalo in this world but me. And what they meant is, when they say the house is settled, again, my life really speaks to the work that I do. When I talk about uncovering the powerful worlds of African women, my name, my life speaks to it. I describe my name, Onalo, as being the wanted girl child. We tend to hear in Africa where, they're having so many kids because they're looking for sons. No, my parents were looking for a daughter. Right? Before I was born, they had one daughter and two sons. They wanted another daughter. And once they had me, they named me Onalo. The house has settled. We are complete. We are done. 2 girls and 2 boys. So that's where my name comes from. Yeah.
You have not only completed your family, you continue to complete us who are readers of your work and admirers of your research. As the lady who told you will represent her well, I can tell you, you continue to represent us well. That should continue to cover many of us. We are proud of your work. And I would ask you to read for me the preface of this amazing work now.
I would be delighted to do so. Thank you. So the preface of my book is called Until Lions Have Their Own Historians, the story of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. Africanizing knowledge, feminizing knowledge. Whose histories, whose stories, whose archives? Almost 6 decades ago, Africanist historian Terence Ranger pondered the question of to what degree African history was actually truly African, and whether the methods and concerns derived from Western historiography were in fact sufficient tools for researching and narrating African history. This issue remains a foremost concern of many African-born researchers, such as myself, who continue to question the manner in which African worlds have historically and contemporarily been reconstructed. We are cognizant of the fact that Africa was the site of some of the worst external abuses, a reality which resulted in a production of knowledge that has almost exclusively been shaped by these influences. We also share concerns regarding the ability of Africans to tell their own stories on their own terms, free from Eurocentric biases. We are especially concerned about this because the inconceivable and arbitrary violence born out of slavery and colonial discourse has produced an African canon that is as dehumanizing and silencing as brute force. From Muslim traders and travelers of the 7th to the 15th centuries, documenting African worlds in their travel logs, to the accounts of European and Arab slavers, travelers, missionaries, colonialists, writing African worlds during the age of exploration, international slave trades, and conquest, these narratives have survived in what the 8th king of Dahomey, King Angelo, described in 1793 as, quote, books that never die, end quote, chronicling historical perspectives that were variously skewed, incomplete, and or ethnocentric in their leanings. It is these narratives that have propelled the very nature of Africanist scholarship in the present day. Again, I ask, whose stories, whose histories, whose archives? Given this historical reality, I have responded to the challenge of Africanizing and feminizing knowledge by attempting to restore voice and dignity to a people beset with memories of having been reduced to objects by slavers and colonial oppressors. I have done this by reframing and retelling the African gendered narrative in solidly African-centered and gendered terms. The end result is a body of scholarship, 6 monographs and a slew of journal articles and book chapters that is unapologetically African-centered. I have not rested easy with simply writing back at the received African canon. I have also, for the past 30 years, dedicated my career to honing my teaching of African history in the U.S. college classroom. At Michigan State University, I have developed and taught several award-winning undergraduate level courses on Africa, courses in which I have disseminated African-centered knowledge about Africa to thousands of young and inquiring minds. In this context, I see myself as a missionary in reverse, one whose job it is to teach African worlds on their own terms, a person whose job it is to teach Africa in the ways that Africans themselves conceptualize their histories and their worlds. And the end result of this pedagogical odyssey are histories that do not always neatly fit into Western-defined models of historical writing, understanding, and interpretation. Take, for instance, the fact that Africans do not necessarily conceptualize their histories in exclusively linear and strictly chronological terms. The proof of this can be found when a researcher approaches a living African archive, an African elder, with the following clear-sighted question. What year did a particular event occur? Or, how old are you? These questions may seem simple and straightforward, and thus could be expected to elicit simple and straightforward answers. But no sooner does the elder respond that he or she does not know what year the incident happened, or worse still, shares with said researcher that he or she is about 150 years old, then said researcher realizes that he or she has not asked the right questions. The right questions. The African-informed question should not be, in what year did a particular event occur, or how old are you? They should instead be framed to discern what might have been happening historically around the time of the event or the elder's birth. Questions such as these would be sure to elicit more precise answers, answers such as the following. The event occurred when daytime became nighttime. Read, during the coming of the locust. So my father describes when he was young, he was about, 5 years old? And they were playing outside, and all of a sudden, daytime became nighttime because the locust covered the sun. Or, I was born during the time of the great destroyer. Read, during the great influenza. Again, I ask, whose questions, whose archives, whose answers? For informed inquiry elicits informed answers and interpretations. I teach what I describe to my students as the history of another Africa. An Africa that they most likely will not find in the average run-of-the-mill textbook. But it is the Africa that I know intimately, that I breathe, that I love. It is the Africa of my mother, grandmother, and all the African women who have, during my past 30 years of researching and writing African gendered worlds, entrusted me with their stories. It is an African history that continental Africans recognize and see themselves in. These are our histories, our stories, our archives. Thank you.
Very well done. Very, very well done, Nwando. Is there anything else you'd like to share with me about this very important project that I have not asked you?
No, that I can think of anything. I don't know that I can. Actually, I don't know. I don't. I think this was just thank you. Let me just say thank you for this opportunity. It was a long time coming, but this has been one of my favorite interviews, just with regards to the questions that you've asked, and just really having a very clear understanding of what it is that I was trying to do. So thank you for the opportunity. Always. Thank you.
Well, I also want to thank you for finding the time and very, very, very well done.